And welcome to another K6 Office Hours. I'm Nicole van der Hoeven. I'm a developer advocate at K6. And today, for this Halloween special, I have Tom. You
Hey,
want to introduce yourself for those who haven't watched the other Office Hours you've been on?
sure. My name is Tom. I'm on the professional services team at K6, and I'm happy to be here. Woo!
Great. So today, I think we should start off with what you mentioned earlier, Tom.
What's that?
The thing that you were going to mention.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes. Yeah, it was just brought up in the Slack channel internally that we've now got a cloud release notes page. K6 Cloud Release Notes. So if you've ever wondered what's going on the K6 Cloud, you can now check it out online. Do you have the URL? How do I
Yep,
put it
I
in chat?
just
Yeah,
posted it
cool.
in chat as well.
Nice. Yes.
Floor
So
says she's here for Halloween puns. Are there going to be Halloween puns?
we'll try our best.
Sure. Tom's come up with some really interesting things he's going to lay on you later. No, I don't know. You're welcome to make Halloween puns for us. So this show is actually Floor's idea. Because it's Halloween this weekend, we wanted to talk about something spooky, things that scare testers, and in particular, load testers. So I think that one of my favorite things about testing is that it touches many aspects, like from the business to development and then testing, operations. It just goes through the entire cycle. And I think a good tester is at least interested in every phase, even if you're just brought on for a specific thing. That doesn't mean that you can't, question requirements. And I love that because I think all roads lead to testing, but at the same time, it can be the same thing that I love about it can also be the thing that's most difficult. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah. Um, yeah. Not not much more to add really. Yeah, let's.
It's Yeah, because there's a lot to go wrong, right? And it also depends on the team that you're on. Because if you're on a team where everybody thinks that quality is your responsibility, it can be that's such a broad thing. Like quality of an application in general, that's not a responsibility that can be borne by one person.
Hmm.
Do you still
Yeah.
find that, Tom, in professional services engagements with K6?
Well, I think, quite often one becomes the deliverer of bad news, and that in itself, the potential to be that person giving someone the bad news, that this application that's uh, been developed over the course of several years ultimately doesn't meet the performance criteria. You could be the one that's delivering that news, and that can be quite a lot of pressure for people. um, and it's also difficult to um, you have to be sure that what you're reporting is actually correct, that there was no mistakes done in the actual testing methodology, and so that could be pretty scary. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about the planning phase when you don't really know, when you've just gotten into a project and you don't really know anything yet. What are some of the things that are the most scary for you?
Um, I guess not having the complete picture, not fully understanding the architecture. I guess that can be, and that's a solvable problem. Yeah, a lot of times you just need to ask the right questions to figure that one out. Certain personas can be challenging to work with. That's also something that could come up. That there are individuals who um, seem intent on making life difficult for no particular reason. Maybe it's because they're under a lot of stress themselves, and need someone to take it out on. But yeah, every single application that you test initially, it's going to be a bit scary as you discover the inner workings of it. And so yeah.
Yeah, and also, have you ever been in a project where even where people have been willing to help, but maybe it's like a microservices based architecture and there are these disparate siloed teams and they don't really talk to each other. So even though they're willing to help, there's no person that knows the entire flow of a message. I
Hmm.
find that scary. It's not insurmountable, but it is scary to be the one that has to put all the pieces together.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you kind of just discover a lot of politics sometimes between the different teams, and you kind of you do have to tread lightly so you don't end up being seen as a threat, really. Yeah.
Yeah. I know when I was doing contracting, I was often called in because there had already been a performance incident in production. And so when you come on after that, there's this preconception from the rest of the team that you're there to critique their work and,
Hmm.
basically solve the issues that they created. And that's just like that's the worst possible environment I think to come into, and that's the worst
Hmm.
attitude because I don't see it as our job to point the finger at somebody else because any issue like that I think is a problem, is the fault of many people if not everybody that was involved, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, people should really just be grateful that you're pointing out what the problems are, and that's often the difficult part, and that's why people do load testing, and that's why it is considered to be one of the more difficult, disciplines in testing, because you do need to have a pretty good understanding of, client server architectures and the protocols involved, and yeah, it's that, the the fact that you are that one delivering the bad news. It's assumed that you've done your due diligence in ensuring that the testing has been done properly as well, and if people catch any kind of hint of that not being the case, then they'll start doubting the output that you're showing. So
Yeah. Floor has a good point here. She says technical debt can be daunting. Yeah, that's true. To come in and to inherit all of that, that can be. Have you? I guess that this is a little bit in the scripting part, but sometimes if the team already has a lot of scripts, but it's in a different tool, and you're tasked with having to reinvent all of it, that's a big ask. Can be
that's
daunting.
true. Yeah, yeah. Especially if
Moaz
you're new to it.
Adele.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, 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 go ahead.
Sorry about that.
That's all good.
Moaz Adele says the scary faces when trying to determine the baseline and load scenario or profiles. Yeah, that's
Mhm.
that is a fear. Let's talk about that actually. So one of the things that I had thought of doing was for this episode was to talk about recent public fails. The truth is though, ever since I got started with tech in general and being on the building side of the software, I don't know, I think you just get a lot of empathy for other teams. I don't want to call anyone out because it's scary. Can you imagine working for something that's for a site that has a potential to go viral? How do you plan for that when like human irrationality really has a big part to play in what goes viral and what doesn't. It doesn't always make sense. It's not predictable, right? So it is very difficult to come up with the load scenarios or profiles. I mean, there are ways to be more educated about our guesses, but in the end, they're still guesses to some degree, right?
Yeah, that's true. And you could argue, uh, uh, if you are suddenly going to experience, if your site does go viral, in some ways that's a nice problem to have. And if people start writing about it, well, any publicity is good publicity. So it's not the end of the
Yeah.
world in some ways, I guess. But there's definitely some applications where if it's uh, if it hasn't been tested according to stress scenarios, and it turns out not to work when it goes live, then it could be quite damaging for it. And that's really why I think there's different types of tests you want to run. Baseline, you just run with a single virtual user through all of the flows and capture your best case response times. Then I think what I typically do is run a sort of realistic test, and then there's also the stress tests where you go way beyond realistic tests to see when something breaks. And I think if you at least run those different types of tests, and even if you don't know how the application's going to be used when it's made live, then you'll still have tested it to a good extent that hopefully you'll catch things before they get revealed in production.
Yeah. And what about, I know it's still not, you said it's not the end of the world, and it's still not, but I'm always extra wary when I'm on a project that's like for the government or for mission critical apps. I once worked, this was not as a tester, but I once worked for an airline, and I was this was early on, I think I was doing data entry or something, and mistakes that we made on the team could ground airplanes, which cost thousands of dollars an hour. Because if we didn't have an application that could update in real time which parts had gone under maintenance and which hadn't, that's a security issue, and that's grounds for saying that a plane can't take off. And so that's actually how I got into testing, because there were engine components in particular that weren't updated in real time, and we needed a system that was reliable enough to get that through. When any sort of project like that is scary. It's exciting, but it's also scary, right?
Hmm. Yeah, imagine testing air traffic control systems.
Ooh, yeah.
Those are probably the
That's
scariest
pretty
ones,
scary. Or like,
where issues
what
start
about
arising
like
with some
medical
local mode.
stuff? Like, what if we get to
Yeah.
testing medical surgery software? That's pretty scary. Let's talk about scripting. What are some scripting fears that you've faced?
Well, I have to go back to my early days in load testing, where I didn't know how to program. I didn't know very much at all, really, and I was asked to resurrect some scripts that hadn't been used for a long time, that no longer worked because the application they were targeting had changed. Um, but
What language was it in?
C++.
Oh,
So
wow, okay.
never really looked at code very much, and suddenly faced with C++. There was some Java as well. The Java stuff was a bit easier to get my head around, but anyway, it touched on all of the really common things you do with when you're writing automation scripts, correlation, parameterization. Well, those are probably the two main things. So, very quickly figured out that these things are very important to the functioning of your script. And so, yeah, it was just overwhelming at first, but really, once you kind of get over that, and when you understand that it's very important to pay attention to what you're seeing, attention to detail is like one of the key things I feel for load testers or even automation engineers in general. The fact that you can run your script, observe the results, tweak it. If you're not getting the right result, run it again. It's very easy in that sense that you can. The debugging cycle, the debugging loop is quite straightforward, and it doesn't really change much beyond that. The projects I do these days, there's still a large portion of that is making sure you're doing data correlation correctly, and yeah. So, but it can be very challenging. If you've never programmed before, especially if you don't know much about the HTTP protocol or even WebSocket or gRPC. It's very front loaded, isn't it? The amount of knowledge you
Yeah.
need in order to be able to be effective. So
Yeah,
yeah, that can be.
unless you're like a permanent tester for an organization, I think there's this expectation that as a performance testing contractor, you should be able to either remember your experience with different technologies or be able to pick it up really easily. And to a certain extent, I think that that's a good thing because I don't think that you need experience with every single tool, because once you know the basics, once you understand the larger picture of what you're trying to do with a test, then you can learn that particular tool or that particular language. But on the other hand, it can be very daunting to suddenly be faced with some weird proprietary language that you suddenly have to get up to speed with very quickly, and it's not something that's ever used before.
Mhm.
Have you ever used Silk Performer?
No, I've heard of it.
They,
It was one of our competitors, and I don't know if they're
oh
still around
right.
these days. Are they? Silk,
I
Silk
think they are,
Performer.
but since they were acquired, I haven't really heard that much. It's actually a good tool, but they use BDL. I can't remember what it stands for, but I haven't seen that language used anywhere else. So for my first engagement, I was like, oh no, how am I going to do this? you know,
Yeah.
you I guess the way that I get over that particular fear is to be open about it. I never go in saying, yeah, I'm an expert when I've never even touched it. I'll say, no, I've never had experience with it, but here are the other tools that I've had experience with in the past that I also had to learn on the job. And I'm just like anybody else. I'm going to Google and ask people for help if I need it. But I do think that it is still daunting, right? To be the new
It
person
is.
that's completely lost.
Yeah. I
And
guess the
correlation
only.
is a big thing too.
Yeah. I was gonna say
I,
um, that that you reach a certain point where you start becoming confident in what you don't know, as opposed to you eventually you just know how everything fits together, what application and client server architectures tend to look like, and they're pretty much always going to share similarities. So when something new pops up, it's probably not going to take you very long to figure it out. It's still new, it's still a bit daunting, but if you just pay attention to detail, and if you can try and tweak something and try again, you'll eventually figure it out, and then you realize there's nothing really that's scary at that point. So
yeah. I was going to say that the correlation is one of the things that, when they have the picture of an iceberg and you see the top, and maybe you've gone through the requests in DevTools or something. That's usually what I do to scope out a site, a web app. I just put on web tools and look at the network panel, and then have a look at the requests, and sometimes they seem pretty straightforward, and then you start scripting and then realize just how much correlation needs to be done. But maybe we should back up. How would you explain what correlation is?
well, it's when a server sends some dynamic value to the client, and in order for the client to then send a valid request back at some later point, it doesn't necessarily have to be the next request, but it could be some point in the future conversation. It'll need to send that dynamic value. If you don't, the server's going to go, nope, not accepting that request. So they're used for a variety of different purposes. State is probably one of the main ones, but also security, making sure that no one's tampering with requests between the client and server. Dynamic IDs, very important. If you don't have them 100% correct, the ones that are mandatory, then you're going to get unexpected responses, and you're not going to be simulating a client properly. the server's just going to send you back an error instead of doing some processing. It's probably quicker for the server to throw you an error page back than actually doing what it was meant to be doing with that request, like a create order where you're not sending the correct dynamic IDs. It's just not going to create the order, which could involve tons of other backend systems. So really making sure that you're getting the expected responses is the key, and doing correlation properly is one of the things you have to do to get there.
So Bill said ghost requests. Do you know what a ghost request is?
um,
Is
I
that a
guess that's
real thing,
requests
or
that
is he
appear
just
out of
trolling
nowhere.
us?
It's it's responses that don't have an associated request, I guess. Ooh, it's like got a
Yeah.
response, but there was no request. I don't know.
They just knew we were there and sent a request. But yeah,
There you
so
go.
the problem with correlation is when you, and this is a good case for recording, when you know that you have an application that has a lot of dynamic IDs, like you said, Tom, and correlation. It's a good candidate, I think, for recording. I like to have one session that I can look through and then check, like, okay, was the request and the response is here. Now the second request is passing a certain value in the header. I don't know where I got it from, so what I'll do is I'll take that value, copy it, and then do a find on the response for the previous request, and then
Mhm.
see where that is. And the problem is, like you said, it's not necessarily the last request that it came from. It could have been the very first one when you first logged in or something. So that's when it gets tricky.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're really complex or very secure applications that do this for every single step, and multiple ones for every step.
hmm Yeah, one example that pops to mind is ASP.NET with view state
Oh,
values.
yeah.
Yeah, those are usually on pretty much every single request. And I think ASP.NET, I don't know if it's a feature of the language, but quite often there'll be some really complex post data forms, web forms that are being basically bounced back and forth between the client and server. So it's maintaining state in each and every request, and that can get ugly pretty quickly. So if you're having to test an ASP.NET based website, I'm sorry.
Yeah, another one that comes to mind is the Oracle suite of apps, like banking apps. And of course, that's the reason why the security is the reason why they do that, because obviously in any sort of financial application, security is a very big deal. You don't want anybody to be able to access your accounts or even your, mortgage applications or anything like that. But every move has several view states
hmm
and many IDs that you have to correlate. That's when it's difficult to use a protocol level tool. I think that's a good candidate for using something that's more browser based, if that's at all possible.
Yes. Yeah, agreed. Yeah. I
And
guess
I think go on.
I guess the good news is, for the most part, 95% of the time, you can say that, if the browser can do it, then you should also be able to do it at the HTTP level. Um, the only time when that gets a bit tricky is when there's some kind of encoding or encryption going on of the actual HTTP payloads. So if you might have some post data, but it looks like a bunch of random characters. Well, if you're able to interact with the service in the browser, it means that there's some JavaScript running, there's some client-side JavaScript somewhere that's encoding the data, and then you can literally just go hunt for the JavaScript that's doing it, and copy and paste it into your script. If with K6 we are scripting in JavaScript, so quite often you'll just be able to copy and paste the encode and decode functions from that are running in the browser, and simulate it in your K6 script. If you're in other languages, I think there's even bridges to be able to run JavaScript in the context of Java, for example. I think I had to do that once at one point, and then with another tool. But basically, if the browser can do it, you should be able to do it as well in a script.
Yeah, but then there's also the rise of single page apps now that are done in a browser, but then when you look at the traffic, there's barely any. And what's happening is that the traditional way that applications are built is that the processing is done by the application servers on their side. But these single page apps, part of the reason that some applications are on it now is that they kind of offload the processing, the need for processing and the resources that are required by it to the client side. So there are lots of JavaScripts or other scripts that are firing off on the client side. Now the problem is with protocol level scripting tools, they might download those scripts, but they don't execute them in the way that a browser would. So there's like a whole generation of browser-based tools now that have to do that because there are tools where there's no way to test them using the protocol level.
Yep, yep. It's funny that it's a battle that's been going on for decades now. How much to run on the client and how much
Yeah.
to do on the server, and it does just seem to keep bouncing back and forth. We go through waves where no, let's rethink this. Let's do it all on the client. No, the client's doing too much now. Let's put it back on the server, and it's like we can't figure out what the best situation is. So I guess a bit of both is probably the right answer.
Is there a particular engagement that comes to mind when you think about particularly tricky protocols or scripting challenges?
Yeah, there was one. I forget the name of it, but it's one of these big enterprise applications. Uh,
Citrix?
no, no. Well, yeah, I guess, yeah, for different
Because
reasons.
that's what was going to be mine.
Well, I was going to say something like SAP or something, but
Oh,
SAP
yeah.
is kind of, that does have a proprietary binary protocol that it uses. At least the rich client, the old school SAP. I think these days it's all web based. Yeah, PeopleSoft, IBM. I think it was an IBM product. But basically, it was really messy at the protocol level. No surprise that people were wanting to test it for performance. But
Yeah.
even something like Salesforce can be very complex, and it's generally speaking, it's the applications that are very customizable that are
Yeah.
going to be the most challenging to do at the protocol level. The customizations that these sites cater for, these applications cater for, inherently
SAP,
make the
sorry,
protocol communication difficult. Yeah, go ahead.
sorry. SAP is tricky because they have a lot of the legacy SAP apps are like desktop apps. So that's already difficult to test. But then they have this thing now that where you can put those apps on the web, so you can make it kind of like a web app. The problem is I once had to test that, and the way to do it was using keyboard shortcuts.
Oh,
So it was a very different way to test.
wow. So it was literally like the green screen version inside a browser.
Yeah, it's
So
like
that
it was virtualizing it. So there were no DOM elements that you could use to interact with. So the easiest way was keyboard shortcuts. Then you have to have a tool that does support that, where you can just send the keyboard shortcuts. But yeah, so I mentioned Citrix as well. I once had to test this Citrix implementation, so I had to see how many virtual machines could be started through Citrix, and that was really difficult. I tried several tools for it, and I ended up using LoadRunner, and it was still a pain. It's just a hard one to test. Had to do bitmap comparisons. There's nothing, again, there's no like DOM elements that you can search for or something in the response. So what you do is you take a screenshot of what you should see, and then during the test you take a screenshot during the test and then compare. But there are issues with that because weird things happen when you're rendering a page or in this case, a machine.
Yeah. Yeah, I've done a few Citrix projects in my time because it was one of the
Citrix
applications.
retreat. Okay, that's pretty good. Oh, Flora is just like on fire here with all of the Halloween puns, spooky application platform. I'd agree with that. I think that's appropriate. There was another thing that comes to mind where it was on the TCP protocol and it was all binary data. So it had dynamic data and I needed to do correlation, but the responses were in binary, and then I had to figure that out, and then like decode it and then encode the request. It was like it was very interesting. I loved it, but it
Hmm.
was definitely scary at the beginning.
Yeah, that kind of stuff can be really tricky, and that requires a lot of trial and error as you're figuring out how to do that decryption and re-encryption as well. Once, because you can't send the decrypted traffic to the server, it's still expecting it in its encrypted form, so you have to be able to do both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also a
Uh,
pain to debug or to troubleshoot because you can't just look at the response and know what it's saying. You have to get it and copy it and paste it and then decode it. Oh, that's so difficult.
mhm.
Carlos Quiros says, Socket IO is possible test. I don't know
Yeah,
what
so
Socket IO is.
Socket.io, I think, is basically it's an implementation of WebSocket, or
Oh, okay.
behind the scenes it uses WebSocket. So it adds a bunch of functionality to a WebSocket, interaction on the client and the server, to cater for some things that aren't part of WebSocket itself. I believe I might be wrong, but it's used quite a lot when for people looking to do stuff over WebSocket and they just need more functionality. Um, let's see. But
Yeah,
yeah, I
so
believe we've
that
had
means
users
yes.
test. Yeah, because we have a support for WebSocket. Um, we should, in theory, support Socket IO as well.
Yeah, so I just posted a response as well with a link to our documentation on how to use K6 to test that. I haven't used Socket.io in particular, but if it's WebSockets, it should be fine. Okay, let's talk about execution. Any fears come to mind on this front? So you've got this, at this point,
Yes.
we've done the planning. Oh, we never addressed, we never talked about the load profiles that were mentioned earlier by Moaz. Yeah, actually, the load scenarios and profiles, workload modeling in general, is a huge thing because it has to happen earlier on, and you might not know the application really well at that point, and that can be difficult to get right.
Yep. One of the key topics there is, are you trying to run a realistic load test where each virtual user maps nicely onto the activities of a real user? And uh, the one thing that bridges that, or attempts to bridge the two, is the concept of think time, using sleep statements in your script to actually slow down the execution of your script. So, if you don't use any sleeps in your script, your each virtual user will run it as quickly as we can run the JavaScript code, and how quickly the servers that you're interacting with respond. And so each virtual user, in effect, without a sleep statement, becomes a hyperactive user. And so, when you run 1,000 virtual user tests, well, it's actually more equivalent to tens of thousands of real users, and so that's an important thing to bear in mind. But then you have the question, what is a realistic think time? How long should your sleep durations be? And that's almost a science in its own right, trying to get that guess what that number should be. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
what do you feel is the number, Nicole?
Oh, just like the number for to answer everything, probably 42.
42. Nice. You're probably not that far from what it actually ends up being, because the sleep time has to take into account that people go off for a cup of tea over lunch. They'll still have the application open on their machine, but they're not going to be using it for a good you know several minutes at that point. Whereas other times they'll be clicking through every few seconds. But if you're to design a realistic test, you have to take into account that people will, for an extended period of time, not be doing anything with the application. So I remember working with one guy who was convinced it was something like 30 seconds. So yeah,
One
it's
of
it's true.
the one of my favorite projects that I worked with in terms of workload modeling is a gaming company. They did many things, but in particular, I was on the team that was testing for horse racing and the bets that they were selling for a horse race. It's called the Melbourne Cup in
Hmm.
Australia, and it is huge at least in Australia, it's huge. And what was so interesting about that is sometimes when you do workload modeling, you also have to understand a lot of the business. So I'm personally not a gambler really. I don't place bets on really anything. But and that meant I had a lot to learn because in order to script in order to figure out which transactions I was going to script, I had to understand different betting types. There's apparently like a distinction between pari-mutuel bets and fixed bets. So fixed bets are like they are calculated by mathematicians on the team, and there's just a price, like that's the odds. And that tends to be simpler to test because as long as that number gets updated in real time, there's no computation involved because the computation is on the part of the people that are setting that number. But the
Hmm.
pari-mutuel one is different because it takes all the bets, and based on how many people have bet on a particular horse versus another, the odds change. That really requires a lot more processing power. So I had to think about these things and incorporate that in a load test because the load profiles, the load that they exert is not the same. So how much of the bets are pari-mutuel and how much are fixed? Those are not things that I ever would have thought of. That's not
Yeah.
common knowledge. You wouldn't think that that's something you'd need to know for performance testing, but sometimes it is
Yeah.
necessary. And
In an
another thing
ideal
for the
world, someone else has done all the. Sorry, got a bit of delay between us.
yeah,
Like
that's
ideally,
right.
someone else would be
Between
providing
Portugal
all
and the
of the.
US.
Yeah, or it just might be my internet connection actually. It's like cutting out quite a bit.
What were you saying?
Uh, yeah, that ideally someone else is the one giving you the figures that you then need to translate into your transcribe into your performance test. I know on one occasion that backfired because someone had done the calculation wrong. So they'd given some number of requests per month or something, and then they were trying to work out what was going to be per second, and they'd missed out one of the divisions. They were going from number of days from 30 days in a month, so divided by 30 to get per day, divided again by hour to get per hour. And yeah, they missed out one of the steps, and so the numbers I was given were just way higher than they should have been. And
Yeah.
of course, the site didn't handle it, and so there was this whole like, oh, is this actually a realistic test? And it turned out not to be the case. So
Yeah.
mm,
Yeah, I think most people tend to think, oh, if your test was for more than what it actually is, that's a good thing because you're erring on the side of caution. Well, yeah, but also there's a lot of resources that you wasted that weren't necessary, both in terms of time and actual money for running environments and having that available. Those things don't come free, and they're not
hmm
cheap either.
yeah,
So I think that's one of the things from the execution part that I fear. It's environment contention. Have you ever run into that as well?
Other people using the environment, yeah, it can affect your results especially if they're the functional testers. It's usually the functional testers. I'm sorry to blame them, but they'll be running some heavy batch process, and all of a sudden you see that huge spike on your performance test that you've been running repeatedly without any issues, and you're like, what is going on here? But I think it's usually load testers that annoy the functional testers more, because you might have some scripts
Yes.
that are creating lots of data, and all of a sudden they can't find their test case, in the list of orders anymore, because there's all these other load generated orders in there instead. So, um, but yeah, there can be a bit of contention on environment sometimes. Ideally, you'd have your own completely separate performance test environment.
Yeah. The problem is, though, that sometimes there are other forms of performance tests that you might want to run in staging or system integration environments, right? So yeah, I can definitely. I've been on that side where I trashed an environment, and I didn't realize that there were functional testers who were so annoyed because everything suddenly became really slow. It's a matter of communication, but communication can be hard.
Hmm. Yeah.
And of course, the answer is always, well, why don't we just test in production? Which is a whole other scary thing, right?
Hmm. Yeah. I've done it plenty, and it's okay usually, because someone else is asking you to do that, and ultimately it's their responsibility if anything goes wrong. If the only thing you can do is to be very fast in providing feedback on unusual things that are happening in the test. So if you suddenly see a spike in response times or errors, you better be hovering your finger over the abort button to stop the test.
Yeah.
But there's other ways of dealing with that. You could be testing out of hours. I definitely remember many times of running load tests at 2 in the morning, with a group of guys, all sleepy and eating pizza or something, and trying
Yeah.
to stay awake. But yeah, but then the worst, the really bad things can happen as well. You might suddenly see a problem, you stop the test, and the problem still is there on the system. And then people start panicking. Let's just reboot everything and hope for the best. And yeah, I've seen production environments not come up back after uh, after a load test. So it is scary when that happens, but ultimately someone else has made the decision. You are just the the person who's having to execute the test. So what can you do?
What's even scarier is sometimes test environments are hooked up to production components. So sometimes they just have like the UI or something that's a test environment, or maybe the database, but then it gets hooked up to the production payment servers, or something really scary like that, and you think you're testing in a test environment, so you're trying to break it, whether you're a functional tester or a performance tester. You use really strange combinations on purpose sometimes. And when that shows up in production, that can be a problem. I know once I was on this team with someone who thought he was testing in a test environment, and then we happened to sit next to the operations engineers that had these big monitors of signups. But he was doing like a test data run, so he was creating all of these users. He didn't know that he was creating them in production.
Oh
And so
no.
all the ops people were like, yeah, look, there's an increase in traffic. And then marketing was brought in because they're trying to figure out where is this traffic coming
Oh
from. And
no.
yep, it was a load test.
Uh,
But that's not necessarily, the load tester's fault either, because he was using an endpoint that, to his knowledge, was going to a test environment. but it wasn't. So it's a communication issue, and a lot of the scary things in a performance project, I think, have to do with human factors, things that aren't even related to computers.
Hmm.
Do
Well,
you
other
have any?
times you might treat it as a penetration test. Like, hey, I was able to bring down the
Yeah,
production environment with these scripts. Anyone could have written these, if it's a public website, for example. So uh, it's what is it, white hat hacking?
yeah. I love that because sometimes that is what we're doing, right? We
Hmm.
we sometimes there are tests where you are trying to bring down an application, but with consent.
Hmm.
That there's a big difference there. But also I think that we're trying to a big part of our job is trying to simulate real user behavior, but that's based on the very big assumption that we are good judges of user behavior, and not just we as testers but also the business. Sometimes people do things that are just completely out of left field, and there's no way that you could have predicted that. One thing that I love to say is still on the gambling thing. There was this one application that was for live betting and live racing. But there was another in the same organization where they were virtually simulated horses. So there were no real horses. They were like graphically animated horses. Super cool. But the weird thing was the real live horse race also drove traffic to that simulated horse race. They're completely different applications. So there's no overlap in terms of the architecture, but there was in terms of the load. Why? Because maybe people didn't realize that they weren't real horses. They weren't really sure what they were betting on. That kind of thing is not something you would think to test.
Yeah, that's true. Well,
Or how about things like for a sale, you might think, well, let's only test our site right after the sale goes live. But actually, if you've sent an email or a marketing campaign out beforehand, you should probably also be testing refreshes, like maybe the last 30 minutes or the last hour. That could bring your site down before you even launch the thing because of the anticipation, and people are just refreshing and refreshing, and sometimes hard refreshing, so you can't
hmm,
even cache those results, right? But that doesn't seem like rational behavior or predictable behavior, but I've definitely seen that.
yeah.
So how are we supposed
My
to account for the psychology of it?
Yeah, I think a lot of these things can, with the mail shoot as an example, I really feel that the actual tool that's sending out emails should have some kind of stagger option or something where instead of sending everyone an email in the very same second, that instead, it's over a period of hours so that you have a bit more control over when people are suddenly going to visit your site. Um, I wonder if that's built-in functionality. I guess there is some kind of batch process that sends these emails out anyway, but whether or not it's configurable to do that over a period of time. Certain apps, if you tell everyone, hey, it's going to be available at this very specific time, yeah, people are going to be sitting there refreshing, and then all of a sudden, everyone's going to be wanting to navigate there at the same time, and it's a recipe for disaster quite a lot of the time. So that's a very aggressive ramp up that you have to design in your test to simulate that kind of behavior. So
And you might not necessarily think that as a performance tester you'd be talking to the marketing department, right?
yeah, yeah,
And the
exactly.
marketing
Yeah.
people are just doing their job too. They're not aware that it could drive load at the same time, and that might be an issue. That's something that you have to think about when you're thinking more holistically outside of just the tech of it all. And then also in your example of sending out emails, what about customer support? Because you're sending out emails, but if there's anything controversial or potentially broken, like if you're sending an email about a new feature, you should let customer support know that they may experience increased demand as well, because they might say, they only have 2 people on rostered at that time. There's also a whole thing about scheduling people to make sure that there's going to be someone to handle those requests.
Yep. Yep.
Like, I think COVID has given us lots of examples of these cool interactions between human psychology and software performance. I know in the Netherlands, we have this Corona line, and when it first started, the problem was not, well, okay, they had very early initial problems with the application, but even after they solved those and they were able to book appointments for the test, the COVID-19 test, really quickly, the problem then became shifted to traffic, like actual car traffic, because people couldn't get to their appointments in time because there was so much traffic there. There were so many cars and not enough parking. Is that a
Yeah.
performance testing issue? Maybe not traditionally, but these
Yeah.
human factors affect how users actually get to use your application. So maybe it's worth considering.
Mhm. Yeah.
So just to kind of start wrapping up here, because I could just keep talking to you on this, but what's one small tip that you can share that you use or have used in the past to help you get over some of these common tester problems or fears?
I guess it would be, not to take anything personally. You're being put under a lot of pressure by other people, but you know, uh, you can't take it personally. People are under a lot of pressure when it comes to performance. Performance testing is usually done so late in the day that it's just before release day or weeks before release day, and um, it's sometimes you're going to be the deliverer of bad news, and that's perfectly okay. No one has a right to be upset at you for for doing your job properly. In terms of the fear of never having done load testing before, and that kind of infamiliarity with what you're doing, just pay attention to details. That's really one of the key things with load testers. Having an eye for detail will allow you to notice things that really small things that might seem like they're not that important, but chances are that they could be, like not correlating a particular value. You have to be quite accurate in what you do. And yeah, some things you just can't control. Some things are outside of your control when you're testing. So yeah, just be aware of those things really. Not necessarily a small tip, but a few small tips maybe.
Yeah. There's almost like a tester's hat that you put on where you look at everything with a critical eye, and I guess the goal is to not be is to critique without making it personal, right? You're not criticizing the person. You're critiquing code or processes or even the infrastructure. But do
Mm.
you find that you have difficulty taking off that hat outside of work?
I feel like it's carried. I bring it with me in
Yeah.
other aspects of my life where I'm like, yeah, there's ways you can explain something or say something to someone in a nice way, even though what you're saying is loaded with other things. If someone's written a poor piece of software, you can just point out, hey, this request took really long to respond. I thought you should know that might become a problem later on. Instead of saying, hey, you wrote this really terrible piece of code. What are you doing?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's ways you can communicate that are more likely to get you the intended response, right?
Yeah, and just like testers, developers are people too. They also sometimes are given very big tasks with very short time frames, and no, they usually know that they haven't tested everything, and that's not possible anyway for testing to be completely exhaustive. So I think of it as not really a matter of you're a crappy developer, what are you doing? I think of it as, hey, this one thing, you probably thought that this was not a big deal, and I wouldn't have either, but I talked to this person from the business, and she said that actually a lot of people do it, so maybe we could fix that. Sometimes it's a matter of priorities not matching up, and priorities change as the project goes on. So I think that there are bugs that arise that are either nobody's fault or everybody's fault. It's
Yeah,
usually not just one person making the mistake.
yeah, exactly.
So the tip that I wanted to talk about is it's a really small concrete one that it's not going to solve all the problems or anything, but one thing that just gets a lot of the stress out of my mind is keeping a test execution log. Because when you're testing, especially if you're still in that shakeout phase where you're testing quite often, just maybe not high load, I really like to have a test execution log, which is just a list of all the tests that you've run, and you're putting down, the number of users that you had, the environment that you're running on, the scenario that you tried, how it worked out. And having it that way, even if it's just for you, is really useful, because then you can look back and see, okay, well, I did try that, and this was the problem with that, so I should go and do something else now. But also, if you publish that, put it in some shared drive or something, or maybe include it in your email updates to stakeholders. I think communicating that out to everybody that needs to know is also a really good way of making sure everybody's on the same page. Like, yes, I was testing from this time to this time. Here are the usual times that I test. So, it kind of underscores the point in the case of environment contention. There's no being transparent about when you're testing, and what the results were, means that your job is going to be easier because people know that you're testing at that time. And if you had any issues, calling it out in public means that you're more likely to get those issues addressed, or help in addressing those issues yourself.
Yeah, taking notes. Yeah, that's a very good tip as well. I think we've been here before, haven't we? This is how we started talking
Yeah.
about Obsidian last time.
I think it's funny because I purposely tried not to talk about taking notes, but now that you've mentioned it, that is kind of taking notes, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a lot of common tester fears that that taking notes addresses for me.
That's true. Yeah.
Sometimes you get so lost in what you're doing, and you look up and 4 hours have gone by and you've just been testing the same thing. Then you start to think, did I already test that? Or was that yesterday? Or was that another thing? Or did I test it with a different user? Was that oh, you just get lost. Just write it down, and that way you know you know what you tested, and everybody
Uh,
else does too.
you said somewhere that in a comment to me today that you were trying to figure out if you'd done something, but it was pre-Obsidian, so you just didn't know.
Yeah,
That's great.
yeah. I was 19. I mean, try remembering what you did when you were
Oh,
19, unless it was like a photogenic moment, photographic moment. You probably don't have a record of that, or what you thought, or what you learned. It's pretty much gone. It's just broad strokes.
take notes, people.
Uh,
Take notes.
Yes. So, one thing that I want to, oh, two things that I want to end on. Observability Con is not next week, but the week after that. That's November 8 to 10. So, I'm going to put a link in the chat here. I'm going to be speaking in it, and so are our CEO, Robin Gustafsson, and one of our software engineers, Olha Yevtushenko. And this is one to watch because we're announcing something that's pretty big, and I'm very happy about it. I know Tom is a fan of it as well. We can't really talk about it yet, but it's free to register. Go and listen to us announce it live.
Woohoo.
And
Do people call it
the other thing,
Olicon?
did I just say Olicon?
No,
What?
I just figured,
Oh,
because yeah,
observability 011Y.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But another thing is, we're hiring. Come join us if you think that it would be cool to work with people like me and Tom. We have a few positions open right now. So there's Python engineer, front end engineer, K6 developer advocate, and we're also looking for a product marketing manager. So just a little plug. Please go to that link, k6.io/jobs. And that's it for me. And as Floor says, happy Halloween, people and monsters alike. Thank you for coming on, Tom.
Thank you.
It's always great to have a chat with you. Thank you,
Yeah.
everybody, for listening, and have a good weekend.
Happy Halloween.